The wind whispered across the barren plateau, a cold and steady breath that carried with it grains of dust, scraps of history, and the silence of a land where survival was earned rather than granted. The scope's glass shimmered faintly as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, its fading light turning the distant ridges into shadows. She lay prone, her body perfectly aligned with the massive rifle stretched out in front of her, the long barrel resting on its bipod like a patient predator. Her heartbeat was calm, steady, each inhale measured, each exhale controlled, her finger hovering just above the trigger as if suspended between life and death. They called her many things in whispers. Some called her a ghost, others a shadow, but the name that had risen above all others was the Angel of Death. She neither denied nor embraced it. Names didn't matter to her, only the mission did. The mission was all that kept her alive, all that gave her existence weight. Her comm crackled softly in her ear, a coded signal confirming that the target was in motion, and with slow, deliberate precision she adjusted her scope, the reticle settling over a figure barely visible even at this magnification. 3,200 meters. It was a distance most marksmen would call impossible, a distance that tested not just skill but faith in physics, in the curve of the earth itself, in the invisible winds dancing between shooter and target. But for her, impossibility was a word stripped of meaning. She had trained for years in conditions that broke others, learning to calculate air pressure by instinct, to feel the shift of wind across her cheek, to let mathematics merge with intuition until the act of shooting became something closer to art. Yet even so, tonight was different. Tonight, the weight of history pressed against her spine, and she knew that when the shot was taken, nothing would be the same again. Her mind wandered briefly, not in distraction but in preparation, through the paths that had carried her to this moment. She remembered the first time she had picked up a rifle, not as a weapon but as a challenge. A farm girl in a forgotten corner of the world, she had learned to shoot cans off fence posts before she even learned to drive, her father's hunting rifle too heavy for her small arms, yet somehow steady in her grip. By the time recruiters came searching, her reputation had already reached them. They had promised her a purpose, and though she did not fully understand what that meant then, she had followed. Training stripped away the innocence, sharpened her into steel, carved away hesitation until what remained was precision honed to a terrifying edge. Her instructors had said she had a gift, but she knew better. Gifts were given freely. What she had was earned through blisters, sleepless nights, and endless hours staring through glass until the crosshairs no longer blurred. She had built herself for this, piece by piece, and now the world would see the culmination of that journey. The target moved slowly, guarded but unaware of the storm that had already locked onto him from miles away. He was a figure of infamy, a man whose decisions had cost countless lives, whose name was etched in the grief of widows and the cries of children. Intelligence called him untouchable, hidden behind walls of men and fortresses of concrete. Yet walls meant nothing to a bullet that traveled faster than sound, and men meant nothing when death arrived from beyond sight, from a distance so great they never even knew it was coming. She knew the dossier by heart. His habits, his mistakes, his arrogance. He believed himself safe, untouchable, invincible. That arrogance was his fatal flaw, the flaw she had been sent to exploit. She let her breathing slow again, the world narrowing until it was only her, the rifle, and him. Nothing else existed. Not the politics, not the chaos, not the lives waiting to be changed by what she was about to do. Only the shot. Her fingers slid onto the trigger, gentle as a lover's touch, and for a brief second she let herself feel the weight of what was about to happen. The call came through her earpiece, a cold, mechanical voice, the confirmation that command had aligned all variables. This is the Angel of Death. Target locked. The words hung in the air like scripture, final and undeniable. She exhaled, and with that breath the universe seemed to still. The winds quieted. Time slowed. Distance dissolved. She squeezed and the rifle roared. The shot leapt forward into history, the recoil pressing against her shoulder like the hand of fate itself, and as the sound echoed off the plateau she already knew, this was the moment that would be remembered, the moment when death flew farther, truer, and more inevitable than ever before. The bullet spun through the endless expanse, a speck of metal carrying with it centuries of warfare and seconds of silence, and somewhere 3,200 meters away history prepared to change forever. The silence after the shot was heavier than the sound itself, a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow the entire plateau, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting to know whether history had truly shifted. Through the scope she tracked the path not of the bullet itself, invisible as it tore through the unseen layers of atmosphere, but of the man whose fate it carried. At that impossible distance the delay was inevitable. Seconds that stretched into eternities, each heartbeat a reminder of the razor-thin line between legend and failure. Then, as her reticle steadied on the target's frame, she saw it, the sudden jerk, the collapse, the ripple of chaos around him as guards scrambled without understanding what had happened. He had fallen before the sound of the shot even reached him, crumpling to the ground with a finality that left no room for doubt. For a moment the guards searched the perimeter near him, guns raised, shouts filling the compound, but there was no threat within their walls, no assassin lurking in shadows nearby. The threat had come from beyond their comprehension, from miles away, from a woman lying flat against the earth with her cheek pressed against the stock of a rifle. She watched through the scope not with triumph but with the cold clarity of someone who understood the gravity of what she had just done. It was not just a kill, not just a mission checked off a long list. This was an act that would ripple outward across governments, armies, and nations. A man once thought untouchable was dead by her hand, and the world would demand to know who had rewritten the rules of what was possible. She exhaled again, steadying herself, forcing her pulse back into rhythm. This was the part no training could prepare her for, the aftermath, the weight of knowing that while she had ended one life, she had altered millions more. The call returned in her earpiece, calm and cold, just as it had been before the shot. Target down. Exfiltration in progress. She blinked once, twice, her eyes dry from staring through the scope for hours, and finally eased her finger off the trigger. The rifle still vibrated faintly from the echo of power it had unleashed, but in her hands it felt almost like an extension of herself, an instrument that had sung a single terrible note across miles of silence. She disassembled it quickly, each practiced motion automatic, hands steady, movements precise. Every sniper knew that the moment after the shot was the most dangerous, not for the target but for the shooter. The enemy might not know where she was, but if they narrowed the trajectory, if they triangulated the impossible, the hunter could become hunted in moments. She packed her gear and pressed herself lower against the ground, scanning the horizon not with fear but with a heightened calm, a predator ensuring no other predator lurked nearby. Below, in the valley where the target had fallen, sirens began to wail. Vehicles roared to life, searchlights cut across the compound, and men shouted into radios in a futile attempt to fight an enemy that had already vanished into the wind. She observed them for another minute, unseen, untouched, and then she began to crawl backward, each movement slow and deliberate, leaving nothing behind but flattened grass and a silence that would outlast her presence. The name Angel of Death would spread again, whispered by soldiers, cursed by leaders, exalted by those who believed her cause righteous. She had not chosen that name, but tonight she had embodied it fully, and she knew the legend was no longer a story whispered in dark corners, it was now etched into the record of history. Her mind stayed clear, her body disciplined, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the iron shell of duty and control, she felt the faintest flicker of something else, doubt or perhaps grief, or perhaps only the quiet recognition that every life she took carved away another piece of her own. But she buried it as she always did, folding it into silence, because the mission demanded nothing less. And the mission was not yet over. She still had to vanish into the night, unseen and untouchable, the ghost that had rewritten the impossible with a single shot. The night deepened as she moved through the terrain, her body hugging the ground, her senses stretched wide, each sound amplified, each shadow dissected for danger. She had memorized the extraction route long before the mission began, her mind rehearsing it so often that her body moved now without hesitation, as if pulled along invisible lines of instinct and preparation. The rifle, broken down into its components, rested silently in her pack, the weight of it balanced against her shoulders, but it was more than just steel and glass now, it was the instrument through which she had bent history, and carrying it felt like carrying a crown of fire. She knew that by the time dawn broke, networks would already be ablaze with rumors, intelligence circles scrambling to verify what had happened, politicians drafting speeches before they even knew the full truth. Some would call it justice, others assassination, and others still would call it an act of war. But for her, definitions meant nothing. All she had was the mission, and the mission demanded survival, demanded silence, demanded that she return to the shadows before the world could place her in its blinding spotlight. Her boots pressed lightly into the soil, leaving barely a trace, her figure blending with the folds of the earth as she ascended the slope toward the extraction ridge. Below her, chaos continued to surge, searchlights lancing the darkness, vehicles carving lines of light across the valley floor as if chasing ghosts. She allowed herself a small, controlled breath of relief, not from safety but from the knowledge that they were searching in the wrong places, their fury misdirected by the very impossibility of what she had done. No one wanted to believe a shot could travel that far, strike that cleanly, and so their imaginations trapped them in closer perimeters, blind to the truth that death had come from miles beyond their reach. Her comms clicked softly again, the signal from command sharp and precise. Raven status. She whispered back, her voice low, flat, as if carved from stone. Exfiltration underway. Clear path. They didn't reply with praise. There never was praise. In her line of work, success was not celebrated but expected, and failure was simply erased. She liked it that way. Praise had weight and she could not afford weight. The lighter she remained, the easier it was to carry the burden of her choices. She reached the ridge and paused, crouching low, scanning the horizon with night vision optics, confirming that the approach path was clean. In the distance, a faint light blinked twice, the coded signal of the extraction team. Relief was not something she allowed herself often, but in that moment, seeing that flicker, she felt the closest thing to it. Still, she moved with caution, each step measured, because if her mission had taught her anything, it was that certainty was an illusion, and survival depended on respecting every unknown. She approached the rendezvous point carefully, slipping into a dry ravine, the walls of stone towering over her as if the earth itself sought to shield her from prying eyes. There, half concealed beneath camouflage netting, the extraction vehicle waited, its engine silent, its driver alert. She slid into the rear compartment, securing her gear, and only then did she allow her body to relax by the smallest fraction, leaning back against the cold metal wall as the vehicle rolled forward, hidden beneath the cover of night. For a long time neither she nor the driver spoke. Silence was the language of people who knew the cost of words, and she found comfort in it. Yet as the vehicle crested the ridge and began its descent into the labyrinth of canyons that would carry them to safety, her mind refused to be still. Images played across her thoughts, the target collapsing, the guards scattering, the echo of her rifle's roar fading into silence. It was done, but the resonance of it lingered inside her like a vibration that would not settle. She had killed before, countless times, each shot precise, each mission executed without hesitation, but this one was different. This one would be studied, dissected, argued over in rooms where power gathered, and she knew her name, whether spoken or hidden, would be tied to it forever. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the vehicle steady her, and she reminded herself of the truth that had carried her through every mission. She was not a hero, not a villain, not even a soldier in the traditional sense. She was a tool honed and sharpened, and tools did not ask why. They performed, and then they were put away until called upon again. Yet even as she tried to hold on to that clarity, a question slipped into her thoughts, quiet but persistent. What happens to the tool when the world begins to see it as something more? She pushed the thought away, opened her eyes, and focused again on the darkness outside, because thoughts like that were dangerous and she could not afford them. Not yet, not tonight. Tonight she was still the angel of death, and angels did not question their wings. The vehicle carried her deeper into the canyons, the night wrapping around them like a cloak, and for a time it felt as if the world itself had receded into silence, leaving only the growl of the engine and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She leaned her head back against the cold frame, eyes half closed but never truly resting, her body trained to stay alert even when exhaustion pressed hard at the edges of her mind. Every mission demanded not only precision but patience, and patience was always hardest after the shot was fired, when adrenaline ebbed and left behind an emptiness that no amount of training could fill. The driver kept his eyes on the winding path ahead, hands steady, the kind of professional who understood that silence was the greatest courtesy in moments like these. But she knew the questions burned in him as they burned in everyone who heard the news. How had she done it? How could such a distance be crossed by a single bullet? How could one woman bend the laws of war into something no one had believed possible? She offered no answers. She never did. To explain would strip away the myth, and the myth was as much a weapon as the rifle itself. A myth unsettled enemies, unbalanced them, made them question whether walls and borders could protect them. The angel of death did not give explanations. She left questions behind, sharp as shrapnel, embedded in the minds of those who survived to tell the story. As dawn began to brush the horizon with faint streaks of gray, she felt the vehicle slow. Ahead lay the rendezvous station, an outpost hidden beneath camouflage netting, indistinguishable from the barren earth to anyone who didn't know where to look. The driver glanced at her once, a silent acknowledgement, and she slipped out as the engine went quiet, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. Inside the outpost, the air smelled of oil, dust, and faint electricity from the equipment humming against the walls. She moved through it without pause, heading toward the secure comms room where command awaited her debrief. The men stationed there watched her with the mixture of awe and unease she had grown used to. Some tried to catch her eyes, perhaps seeking the reassurance that she was flesh and blood, not the specter they imagined. But her gaze was steel and they quickly looked away. She entered the comms room, the door sliding shut behind her with a hiss, and the voice of command filled the space, cold and deliberate. Mission confirmed. Target eliminated. Extraction complete. She gave her report with the same precision she had given the shot. Details of wind, angle, trajectory, nothing emotional, nothing unnecessary. When she finished, the line was quiet for a moment and then the voice replied, "History has changed tonight. Do you understand what you've done?" She did not answer. She didn't need to. Understanding was irrelevant. All that mattered was that the mission was complete. When the transmission ended, she stood in the empty room, her reflection faint in the glass of the darkened monitors. For the first time since the shot, she allowed herself to truly breathe, and the silence pressed in around her with a weight that was almost suffocating. She had killed a man whose death would echo across continents, and though she had carried out the mission exactly as ordered, she knew that she had also unleashed something no one could fully control. The shot had proven the impossible possible. It had redrawn the boundaries of warfare, and in doing so, it had redrawn the boundaries of her own existence. She was no longer merely a sniper. She was a symbol now, a ghostly warning whispered in boardrooms and war rooms alike, and symbols could never return to anonymity. She pressed her palms against the table, steadying herself, and reminded herself again of the creed that had carried her this far. She was not to think, not to feel, not to question. She was to act. Yet the thought that had whispered to her in the vehicle returned now, sharper than before. What happens when the tool becomes more important than the hand that wields it? She left the room and made her way to the quarters assigned to her, a small space with nothing more than a cot, a desk, and a single dim lamp. She set her pack down and began to clean her rifle, piece by piece, wiping away the dust, oiling the parts, treating it with the reverence others reserved for relics. For her, this rifle was not an object but a companion, the only constant in a life built on shadows. As she worked, she listened to the faint sounds of activity beyond her walls, men moving, radios crackling, the outpost alive with the quiet tension that came after great events. They did not celebrate openly, but she knew that every one of them felt it, the strange, heavy truth that they had witnessed something that would be remembered long after they were gone. When the rifle was clean, she set it aside and sat on the cot, staring at the floor, her thoughts circling but never landing. Sleep would not come easily, not tonight, perhaps not ever again, but she closed her eyes anyway and let the silence fold around her like a shroud. She had been called the Angel of Death, and tonight she had lived up to the name. Tomorrow, the world would awaken to the story of her shot, and nothing, not her, not the enemy, not the very shape of warfare itself, would ever be the same again. The morning sun rose over the barren landscape, spilling harsh light across the outpost and burning away the shroud of night that had cloaked her return. The world outside was beginning to stir with the first waves of consequence, though inside the compound silence held firm. She sat at her cot, boots planted firmly on the ground, eyes fixed on the rifle now resting in its case by her side. News would already be spreading, leaked intelligence, intercepted comms, fragments of truth twisted into speculation. Somewhere across the ocean, generals and presidents would be staring at briefings, their voices tight as they asked questions no one could fully answer. How far could a sniper truly strike? Was such a shot possible without technology they did not yet understand? And who was this angel of death, the phantom whose presence had bent the very rules of warfare? She imagined the confusion, the denials, the disbelief. She imagined the anger of those who had believed themselves untouchable. But she did not smile. Triumph was a luxury she did not allow herself. For her, the mission had been an execution of skill and discipline, not a performance for the world. Yet she knew that from this point onward, she would not be allowed to remain hidden in shadow. Whether she wanted it or not, she had become a legend, and legends did not get to choose anonymity. A knock echoed faintly against the doorframe, pulling her from her thoughts. It was one of the younger operatives, barely more than a boy, his face pale but his eyes sharp. He delivered a sealed file, no word spoken, and retreated almost as quickly as he had come. She opened it slowly, scanning the printed lines, intelligence briefings, intercepted chatter, satellite images. The ripples of her shot were already expanding faster than command had anticipated. There were riots in cities where the man she had killed had once ruled with iron fists. There were power struggles igniting among his lieutenants, each desperate to seize the throne left empty by a bullet. There were governments on the other side of the world demanding answers, their voices raised in warning, claiming such a strike could only mean escalation into new kinds of warfare. She read every line carefully, absorbing the consequences of her work with the same calm she had felt before the shot. History was unfolding in real time, shaped by the echo of a single trigger pull, and she was both participant and witness. She folded the file shut and placed it neatly on the desk. She did not need to read more. She already understood the truth. The world was shifting and she was the axis. Later, in the dimly lit operations room, she stood before the senior officers as they discussed the fallout. Their voices overlapped, sharp with urgency, weighed down with the knowledge that what had been done could not be undone. Some argued that her shot had saved thousands of lives, perhaps millions, by removing a tyrant whose ambitions had threatened entire nations. Others warned that it had unleashed instability, chaos that could burn beyond borders and drag everyone into conflict. They spoke as if she were not there, as if she were a tool set on the table beside her rifle, useful only for what it could accomplish, dangerous only if it broke. She listened without reaction, her expression unreadable, because she had long ago accepted that her role was never to decide, only to execute. And yet, beneath that practiced stillness, a thought stirred, quiet and unwelcome. Perhaps by pulling the trigger she had become more than an instrument. Perhaps she had become the very spark they all now struggled to contain. When the meeting dissolved, one of the commanders approached her, a man whose face bore the lines of too many years in shadow wars. He studied her with eyes that seemed to search for the human beneath the mask, and at last he said, "You've rewritten history whether you intended to or not. Men like him don't just fall. They leave voids, and voids are dangerous." She met his gaze steadily but offered no reply. What could she say? That she knew? That she carried the weight of it in every breath since the shot? Words would not change what had been done, nor would they ease the burden pressing against her chest. Instead, she turned away, returning to the solitude of her quarters, where silence at least did not ask questions. That night, when the outpost quieted and the desert wind howled faintly against the walls, she sat alone in the dim glow of the lamp, her rifle case open before her. She traced a finger along the cold steel, her reflection warped across its polished surface. She thought of the man she had killed, not as a tyrant, not as a symbol, but as a human being who had once drawn breath and now did not. She thought of the lives that would change for better or worse because of his death. And for the first time in years she allowed herself to wonder, not about the mission, not about the orders, but about herself. How many more times could she do this? How many more pieces of her own soul could she carve away before there was nothing left but the legend they had built for her? She closed the case gently, locking the questions away with the rifle itself, and lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling until her eyes blurred. Sleep did not come, but she did not expect it to. Angels did not sleep. They waited, wings folded in silence, until they were called again. Days passed, though for her they blended into one another like shadows bleeding across stone, each indistinguishable from the last except for the faint shift in the tension that gripped the outpost. The world outside roared louder with each sunrise. Reports filtered in constantly, clashes in cities once kept under iron rule, foreign governments moving troops closer to contested borders, whispers of alliances forming in the dark. Her shot had not ended a war, it had rearranged it, tilting the balance so violently that everyone scrambled to regain footing. She remained in her quarters most of the time, her presence an unspoken reminder that the impossible had already been done once, and could be done again. Soldiers passed her in the corridors with quick glances, their conversations faltering when she entered a room. To them she was no longer a comrade in arms but something else entirely, a living myth clothed in human skin. Some looked at her with admiration, others with fear, but none dared speak openly. Legends demanded distance and she provided it willingly. Isolation was not new to her, it was the soil in which she had been shaped. But even she could feel the weight of it pressing heavier than before, a silence that no amount of discipline could completely drown. On the fourth night, command summoned her again. She entered the operations chamber to find a map spread across the central table, cities marked with bright points of light, lines of movement traced in urgent strokes. The officers spoke quickly, their words sharp with anxiety. The target's death had left a vacuum, and rival factions were tearing at each other to fill it. In one city, old militias had risen again. In another, foreign mercenaries had poured in, hired by men who smelled opportunity in chaos. Entire provinces balanced on the edge of collapse, and international forces debated intervention while denying responsibility for her shot. She stood silently, hands behind her back, listening as they weighed options, their voices clashing with frustration. At last one of them turned toward her, his tone more statement than question. "You may be called again. Another strike, another impossibility to prove. Do you understand? She met his gaze with the same calm steel she always carried. I understand. It was all she said, all she ever said. But inside, a storm whispered against the iron walls she had built around her thoughts. Each mission carved deeper into her, and though she had never failed, she wondered how long before success itself became failure, not for her body but for her soul. That night she sat alone with her rifle again, the weapon stripped bare, its pieces laid out like bones across the desk. She cleaned each one with methodical care, but her mind wandered uncharacteristically, circling around the words spoken in the chamber. Another strike, another impossibility. They spoke of it so easily, as if she were not a person but a machine, a tool to be pointed at a map and unleashed. And perhaps that was all she was. Perhaps that was all she had ever been. Yet as she reassembled the rifle, sliding the pieces together until it was whole again, she felt a pulse of something she could not suppress. Weariness, yes, but also defiance. Not against the mission, not against her superiors, but against the quiet erosion of herself. For years she had buried every question, every flicker of doubt, beneath layers of discipline. But now, in the wake of a shot that had rewritten history, those questions clawed at the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. Was she truly an angel, or had she become a specter, doomed to haunt not just her enemies but herself? Sleep evaded her again, and she found herself pacing the narrow confines of her quarters, each step measured, each turn sharp. She replayed the mission in her mind, not the mechanics, those were flawless, but the meaning. She remembered the target's fall, the chaos that erupted, the soundless power of distance turned into inevitability. And she remembered the moment after, the silence that stretched longer than it should have, pressing against her like judgment. She told herself as she always had that it was not her place to decide meaning, only to perform. Yet the thought gnawed at her nonetheless, a quiet certainty that no amount of denial could erase. Her shot had not ended something, it had begun it. She wondered if command knew that, if they understood that by proving what had been impossible, she had shattered not just a man but a boundary, and boundaries, once broken, could never be rebuilt. Before dawn, she left her quarters and climbed to the roof of the outpost, where the desert stretched endlessly under the pale starlight. She stood there with her hands resting against the railing, the cool metal grounding her as she stared across the horizon. It was silent here, untouched by the chaos unfolding beyond, but she could almost feel the ripple of it traveling across the world, invisible waves of consequence spreading farther than even her bullet had flown. She closed her eyes and let the wind brush against her face, carrying with it the faintest scent of dust and distant rain. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine what life might be if she were not what she had become, if she were not the angel of death but only the girl who once shot cans off a fence on her father's farm. The thought hurt more than she expected, and she opened her eyes quickly, burying it before it could root itself deeper. She could not afford to be that girl again. That girl had no place here, no purpose, no armor against the weight of history. She turned away, descending back into the heart of the outpost, where the silence waited, heavy and unyielding, pressing against her with every step. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of Daniel's room, soft and golden, but he felt none of its warmth. His mind was restless, caught between the fragments of the last few days, the whispered words, the subtle glances, the accidental confessions that Laura had let slip without realizing how deeply they struck him. He lay there staring at the ceiling, hearing her voice echo in his head, and for the first time in a long while, he admitted to himself that he could no longer ignore what was happening. Their friendship had always been close, but recently it had begun to feel like something else, something dangerously fragile yet impossibly strong. Each conversation left behind a residue of unspoken longing. Each accidental brush of hands carried the weight of a secret they were both trying, and failing, to hide. And while he had tried to convince himself that perhaps it was just his imagination, her words over the last few weeks had revealed too much to dismiss. She wanted him, maybe without fully meaning to say so, but she had said enough to undo every wall he had built. Laura, on the other hand, was going about her morning with a storm inside her chest. She had replayed last night's conversation over and over, the way she had teased him lightly, her words slipping out far too boldly, almost as if her heart had spoken before her mind could stop it. "Sometimes I feel like you're the only one who really sees me," she had confessed without thinking. The way his eyes had darkened for a moment, as if holding back a truth of his own, haunted her now. She pressed her hands against the kitchen counter, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. "What am I doing?" she asked herself. The more she tried to treat their bond as simple friendship, the harder it became to deny what she felt. Every phrase she uttered around him seemed to betray her. Every laugh carried more warmth than it should, every silence hung too heavily. She was reaching her breaking point and she knew it. When Daniel entered the kitchen later, the atmosphere was almost too thick to breathe. He greeted her softly, his voice careful, as though testing the ground beneath them. She answered with a smile, but it faltered quickly, her eyes avoiding his. The tension was palpable and both of them knew it. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone low, hesitant. Laura's heart skipped. "About what?" she asked, though she already feared the answer. "About us," he admitted, his gaze finally locking onto hers. "The things you've been saying lately. The way we are together." His voice trembled slightly, but it carried a firmness that told her he had been holding this back for too long. Her breath caught. The words were heavy, almost dangerous, but they were also liberating. "I didn't mean to," she started, but stopped. Lying now would only deepen the wound. She sighed. "I didn't mean to let it slip, but I guess I have. I can't seem to stop myself." Daniel stepped closer, every movement deliberate, as though crossing a forbidden threshold. "Laura, I can't stop myself either." The honesty in his tone left no room for retreat. Her hands trembled slightly, resting against the counter. She wanted to pull away to keep the fragile line of friendship intact, but the way he was looking at her undid every ounce of control she thought she had. His eyes weren't just searching, they were confessing. For a long moment, silence wrapped around them, filled only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Neither dared to move, yet neither could escape the gravitational pull drawing them closer. Finally Laura whispered, her voice breaking, "If we keep going like this, we'll ruin everything." "Or," Daniel countered gently, "we'll finally be honest with each other." The weight of his words crushed the air between them. She wanted to resist, to remind him of the risks, of the consequences that could shatter the delicate balance they had kept for years. But her heart betrayed her, and her eyes softened with the truth she had been too afraid to say aloud. "I want you," she admitted, her voice trembling but unshakably real. Daniel inhaled sharply, as though the confession struck him like a physical force. His hand lifted, hesitated in the air, then finally touched hers. The moment their fingers entwined, the world outside seemed to vanish. There was no past, no fear of what might come, only the raw truth that had been waiting to be spoken. Neither of them leaned in, not yet. It wasn't a kiss, not a physical act. It was something heavier, a crossing of hearts. Their connection, once buried beneath layers of silence, now stood naked and undeniable. Laura's chest rose and fell rapidly, her entire body alive with the weight of the moment. Daniel's hand tightened slightly around hers, grounding her, anchoring them both to the reality they could no longer ignore. This was the breaking point. The line between friendship and something more had been crossed, and there would be no turning back. For the first time, neither of them wanted to. The night had fallen quiet after the storm of confrontation, but the silence was not one of peace. It was the kind that lingered after destruction, heavy with unspoken consequences. I sat at the edge of the porch, staring at the scattered remnants of Karen's so-called authority, the broken clipboard, the trampled signs, and the echo of her defeat. For the first time in months, the air around my cabin felt like it belonged to me again. It was mine, not the HOA's, not Karen's, not anyone's to claim or threaten. And that realization carried a strange weight, a liberation mixed with the scars of battle. Karen had not returned that night. Her retreat had been humiliating enough, but I knew she wasn't gone. People like her didn't disappear. They reassembled, they schemed, they licked their wounds and came back twice as bitter. Yet something inside me had shifted. I no longer felt hunted. The fear she had once planted inside me was gone, burned out by the blaze of defiance. She could knock on my gate again, she could send lawyers or board members, but she could never again make me kneel. The next morning, I brewed coffee and let the steam curl through the open window as the sun lit the lake in golden fire. The reflection on the water reminded me of resilience. No matter how many storms came, the lake always returned to calm. My father, still bruised but recovering, joined me on the porch. He carried the same quiet strength he had shown during his years of service, the kind of strength that spoke louder than any words. He sat down beside me and gave me a look that carried both pride and understanding. "You've done well," he said simply. For him, that was enough. A whole speech compressed into 3 words. I nodded, sipping my coffee, letting the silence between us speak. Later that week, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Karen had vanished from the HOA's front lines. Some said she was suspended, others whispered she had been forced to resign after her reckless stunt with the pepper spray came to light. The board, desperate to save face, issued carefully worded letters about restructuring and new leadership initiatives. But everyone knew the truth: the queen had lost her crown. I still remember the first time I walked down the main street of the neighborhood after it all. People looked at me differently. Some avoided my gaze, ashamed of how they had once sided with Karen out of fear. Others offered quiet nods of respect, as though acknowledging that I had fought the battle they had been too afraid to fight themselves. For me, it wasn't about respect. It was about reclaiming dignity, something that had been stolen long before the first confrontation. Karen eventually resurfaced, but not as the tyrant she once was. I heard she had moved to another city, trying her luck in another HOA, but her reputation followed her. Her name became less a threat and more a cautionary tale. "Don't go full Karen," people joked at neighborhood meetings. And though I never wished her true harm, I hoped she learned something from the wreckage she had left behind. My cabin stood strong through it all. Every beam, every board carried the story of what had happened here. The gate, once battered by her demands, became a symbol of defiance. I left the private property sign up not out of paranoia but as a reminder. This land was not just dirt and trees, it was freedom. The kind of freedom Karen could never understand. Weeks turned into months and the rhythms of life returned. The lake shifted with the seasons, the wind carried new scents, and the quiet of the woods healed the wounds of the past. Sometimes I would still find myself replaying those moments, her voice raised in arrogance, the spray of pepper in my father's face, the righteous anger that had finally broken through my restraint. But instead of bitterness, those memories now carried strength. They were proof of endurance, proof that standing firm against tyranny, no matter how small or petty, was worth it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with fire, I realized something important. Karen had thought this was about rules, about land, about ownership. But it was never about that. It was about control. And when I refused to yield, when I fought back, I didn't just protect my cabin, I protected myself. I reclaimed the power she had tried to strip from me. The world will always have Karens. People who thrive on control, who mistake cruelty for strength. But the world also has people like us, people who stand their ground, who refuse to bow, who remind them that power only exists where it is allowed. That night, as the stars shimmered above the still waters, I finally felt peace settle in. The battle was over. The cabin was mine. The land was mine. The freedom was mine. And no HOA, no Karen, no force of arrogance would ever take it away again. The end.